Thank you all so much. It is fantastic to be back here. This is actually my second visit to UCA. I was here in, I think, fall of 2008, right around the time, actually right after our older son was born. So it's fantastic to be back in Conway. One of my favorite pictures, I mentioned my daughter a little bit ago as a Potterhead. So I've now got that term to add to my arsenal. One of my favorite pictures of her is from right after she was born in 2010. I'm sitting on the couch working on an article, and I've got her like curled up like a little glowworm or something on my shoulder, and I'm wearing my University of Central Arkansas T-shirt, which has since worn out, but I now have a new one after a visit to the bookstore yesterday. So check. I've gotten my new University of Central Arkansas T-shirt. Now, Dr. Harberdahl mentioned something I think it's really, really important about the opportunities that are being offered by ACRE and various other organizations, and that is that those opportunities are paid, P-A-I-D, because the big idea in economics, number one, numero uno, is that people respond to incentives. The economist Stephen Landsberg said, or has claimed, has pointed out, that you can summarize all of economics in 4 words. People respond to incentives, all the rest is commentary. Similarly, a rabbi of several thousand years ago, 2,000 years ago, something like that, said you could summarize the entire Torah while standing on one leg. What's hateful to you, don't do to other people, all the rest is commentary. Econ similar. People respond to incentives. And the incentive, or one of the incentives to which people respond, is the price of anything. The price of the things that you buy, the price of the things that you sell, the price of the things that you demand, the price of the things that you supply. And what I want to do is talk about 3 different ways that governments interfere with prices and the consequences of those interferences, well, we might call them interferences. First of all, I want to talk about price ceilings. I want to talk about price floors. And I want to talk about special taxes on foreign produced goods that are called tariffs. So price ceilings, price floors, and tariffs. Price ceilings are legal maximum prices. Price floors are legal minimum prices. And again, tariffs are special taxes that you have to pay in order to buy goods from foreign countries or in order to sell goods to foreigners. Now, when we think about what prices do, if you've taken an introductory economics class, you might remember talking about equilibrium. And equilibrium is a position where quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. And equilibrium in a competitive market has a few really interesting and really, really useful properties. At equilibrium, we produce the right stuff, we produce it the right way, we produce it in the right proportions, and it goes to the right people. Well, what does this mean? We produce the right stuff. We produce what people actually want. We produce the stuff for which the benefits exceed the cost. We produce it the right way. We produce it at the lowest possible cost. So we produce it at the lowest possible cost. Goods are produced by the least cost, by the lowest cost producers. Okay. We produce it in the right proportions. Quantity demanded is equal to quantity supplied. So we're producing the right stuff in the right proportions in all markets, and it goes to the right people, meaning that it goes to the highest value users. It's a really cool characteristic of equilibrium. The way that I've just framed this is similar to the framing of an economist named Tim Harford, who wrote a really great book about 11, 12 years ago called The Undercover Economist, in which he refers to competitive markets as a world of truth. And in these competitive markets, this world of truth, he argues, we produce the right stuff, the right way, in the right proportions, going to the right people. We maximize gains from trade. We maximize a measure of social well-being in a competitive market when we simply let people buy, let people sell, and let people respond to the prices that they encounter. And this is, in a lot of ways, kind of a social miracle, because there's nobody in charge. There's nobody in charge. And that's really important. When I ask my students, who's in charge of the market? Is it the American Economic Association? Nope. Is it the Securities and Exchange Commission? Nope. Is it Jeff Bezos? Nope. Is it President Trump? Nope. It's nobody. What we have is an undesigned order producing something of practically infinite and unimaginable complexity, and I would argue beauty, okay, that maximizes everybody's ability to live the life that they want to lead, subject to the fact that they're not infringing on others' right to do the same. And prices are the conductors, so to speak, of the economic orchestra that guide resources from where they are of relatively low value to where they are of relatively high value. Prices, again, are the conductors of the economic orchestra, so to speak, that direct resources from where they are of relatively low value to where they are of relatively high value. An example of this might be something like gasoline or plywood or a flashlight after a natural disaster. So I live in Alabama, and Alabama has had some tornadoes recently. About 14 years ago, there was a hurricane along the Gulf Coast that caused all sorts of massive destruction. We've had some heavy rain in Alabama in the last several weeks that's led to a disaster declaration on the part of the governor. Okay. Looks like you guys are having something similar here in Arkansas. And as part of this disaster declaration, after a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina 14 years ago, after the flooding that's happening in different parts of Alabama, after the hurricanes, tornadoes that are happening or have just happened in certain parts of Alabama, these disaster declarations will often include a rule prohibiting what's called price gouging. Okay, there'll be a rule prohibiting what's called price gouging. And the reason that we have these rules, presumably, against price gouging are so that we protect people who are at their most vulnerable from other people who might be acting at their most vicious. Specifically, you have vulnerable people who are in a very bad situation. Your house has just been knocked down. Okay? Your basement is flooded. Trees are down all over the place. You want gas because you need to power a generator because you need to keep your food cold, or you need to keep your medicine cold, or something like that. You're in a very vulnerable position. Meanwhile, at least according to the popular narrative, other people, relatively unscrupulous people, might look at this and say, oh, look at all these vulnerable people. Okay? Let's swoop in and victimize them. Let's jack up the price of gas and jack up the price of plywood and jack up the price of flashlights and jack up the prices of all of these things so that we can profit from their misery. Okay? And it sounds awful. I mean, it sounds like, honestly, it sounds like humanity at its worst to a certain degree. In response to the fear of this, or in response to things like this actually happening, frequently, governments will pass rules against price gouging that say you're not allowed to increase the price of gas, plywood, flashlights, bottled water, etc. after a natural disaster, unless you can kind of justify it by a cost increase. And even then we're not going to let you increase prices that much. The goal, the stated goal at least, of rules like these is to help poor people, to help the vulnerable people, to help people who might otherwise be taken advantage of during their time of need and during their time of distress by an unscrupulous owner of a gas station, say, who might want to charge $10 a gallon for gas that he was selling for $2.50 just the day before, or just even a few hours ago. And so we pass this price gouging law, we go forward with our price gouging law, and we pat ourselves on the back for helping poor people. We pat ourselves on the back for helping the vulnerable, and we pat ourselves on the back for our great humanitarian action. Again, the first big idea in economics is that incentives matter, that people respond to incentives. One of the most interesting and useful and I think important implications of economics is that policies often have unintended consequences. And in the case of a lot of policies that are aimed at influencing prices, these policies have negative unintended consequences that hurt exactly the people that we think we're helping. Okay? And that's important. A lot of these policies reduce the well-being of exactly the people that we think we're helping, those who are most vulnerable in the wake of a natural disaster. What a price control does, again, is it makes it illegal for a firm or an individual to increase the price a lot of a good like, again, gas, plywood, flashlight, bottled water after a natural disaster. Okay. What a price control does, though, is it changes the way people pay for stuff. It doesn't necessarily change what they actually pay. It changes the way they pay, not necessarily what they actually pay. And, as I'm going to argue, it ultimately leaves them worse off. It ultimately leaves people worse off. So what's the first thing, or the first way by which a price control leaves people worse off? Well, there are two big laws in economics. There's the law of demand and the law of supply. And according to the law of demand, if you increase the price of something, people will demand less of it. If you decrease the price of something, people will demand more of it, holding everything else constant. The law of supply says if you increase the price of something, people will supply more of it. If you decrease the price of something, people will supply less of it, again, holding everything else constant. What you get in a post-disaster situation is some combination of a big increase in demand and a big reduction in supply that should drive the price up. When we prevent the price from rising, people don't get the signal that they need to demand less of whatever it is that we're talking about, say gas. Okay? When we don't let the price rise, we cut off the signal that would tell people, that would help us understand, gas is really, really scarce right now. So the quantity of gas demanded remains very, 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 very high. By not allowing the price to increase, we also prevent suppliers from getting the signal that they need to bring a lot of gas into the area. Okay, we prevent suppliers from getting the signal that they need to bring a lot of gas into the area. Okay, and the quantity supplied remains relatively low. We create, by technical definition, a shortage where the quantity of gas demanded is greater than the quantity of gas supplied. Okay? So there's a lot less gas to go around than people want at this controlled price. That's a problem. That's a problem because there are all sorts of unsatisfied wants and people not getting the information. Now then, to which one might be tempted to reply, well, it's not that hard. It shouldn't be that hard. Clearly there's been a disaster, so you should buy less gas. Clearly there's been a disaster, so companies should know that you need to bring gas into these markets or into these places where people are going to need gas. Okay, well, that's possible. But think about a consumer in Southern California. Think about a consumer in Southern California. Well, shoot, for that matter, think about a consumer in Central Arkansas. Where do the tornadoes happen in Alabama? Anyone who's not a University of Alabama graduate know? Roll Tide. Huh? Nope. Anyone? How many of you knew that there had been tornadoes in Alabama recently? All right, a handful of people. Handful of people, not quite everybody. Okay. But here's the thing. You don't need to know this specifically in order to react to price information when we let prices work. And yes, it was Lee County, Alabama, home of the hated Auburn Tigers. Okay, is in Lee County, Alabama. You don't need to know, okay, which is a very different part of the state from Huntsville, by the way. You don't need to know that the tornadoes happened in Alabama. You don't need to even know that tornadoes happened at all. If we allow the price to rise, this tells profit-seeking gas producers and profit-seeking plywood producers and profit-seeking flashlight producers to move gas to Lee County, Alabama, okay, for whatever reason. They just observed that the price has gone up. And here's the cool thing. They transmit all the information to you guys who need to get the message that gas is suddenly really, really scarce relative to what people want it for in Lee County, Alabama. Therefore, you might want to think twice about that next trip to the grocery store, or you might want to think twice about going out with your friends as opposed to staying in, or you might want to think twice about that next thing that's going to involve you driving 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 miles. Okay. To which one might reply, again, yeah, but the average person is not going to change how much they drive because the price of gas goes up by 5 cents a gallon or 10 cents a gallon or 25 cents a gallon. And that's true. A lot of people probably aren't going to change their behavior. But another big idea in economics is that people make decisions at the margin. And just because the average person doesn't mean there's not somebody out there who's going to drive a little bit less just because the price of gas has gone up a tad. So if we left the price alone, and this is again one of the beautiful things, I would argue, about markets, everybody, even people who don't know where Lee County, Alabama is, or don't even know there is a Lee County, Alabama for that matter, okay, everybody gets the signal, they get all the information they need to economize on their gas consumption because that gas is now more valuable in Lee County, Alabama. When we don't let prices work, when we don't let prices rise, we throttle the mechanism that transmits that information to people in Arkansas, people in Arizona, people in Alaska, who again may not be able to locate Lee County, Alabama on a map, but who need to curtail their consumption at least a little bit, because there are a lot of vulnerable and desperate people in Lee County, Alabama, who need gas to run generators and things like that. So, the first thing that we do when we interfere with the price mechanism, when we prevent the price mechanism from working, is we shut off this information transmission. And we create a shortage of gas. Again, where the amount of gas that people want is greater, perhaps even far greater, than the amount of gas supplied. To which one again might reply, yeah, but at least people are paying lower prices for gas. Okay? But I say unto you, they might be paying lower prices for gas, they might be paying lower money prices for gas, but they're bearing either the same cost or a higher cost, because they're paying not just with cash, but they're also paying with their time. They're paying with their gas, they're paying with cash, and they're paying with time. They're paying with some combination of gas and time, some combination of cash, and time, okay, that now reflects their full willingness to pay for the artificially scarce gas now. Okay, now then after we're done, you should look up, Google something like gas lines, or gas lines after Hurricane Katrina, or gas lines after Hurricane Florence, or whatever. And you'll see pictures of lots and lots and lots and lots of people lined up to get gas. You get pictures of lots and lots of people lined up to get gas. What's important to remember about that picture is that while people are not allowed to pay more with cash, they're encouraged to pay with their time. And the full value of the difference between what people are willing to pay and the cash price they're allowed to pay can dissipate as people wait in line to get gas. Because what else could they be doing? What else could you be doing if you weren't waiting in line to get gas? Literally anything. Literally anything. In a disaster situation, in a disaster scenario, there's probably going to be no shortage of work. If you have a chainsaw, for example, you might be a very, very, very valuable person who could probably earn a decent living or probably earn a decent amount of money cutting logs, clearing wood, and things of that nature. If gas is $10 a gallon, and all of a sudden you can earn 40 bucks an hour running your chainsaw and cutting logs, then you might say, well, maybe I'll kind of hold off on the gas and I'll go cut logs for a while, or I'll go cut wood and do some clearance work for people for a little bit. When we hold the price of gas artificially low at $3 a gallon, then someone might say, well, okay, if gas is $3 a gallon, I'm just going to wait in line for it. They give up then the opportunity to earn income by clearing debris and clearing waste and clearing logs and wood and stuff like that. And instead, they expend that valuable resource, their time, waiting in line and waiting in line and waiting in line and waiting in line to get gas. The world is poorer. The world is poorer then to the tune of the production that could have taken place had you or your friend with the chainsaw actually gone out and done work instead of standing in line to get gas. So the cruel irony of a price ceiling in this case is again that it does a couple of things. Well, first, it creates a shortage, but second, it leaves people worse off than they would have been had we allowed the price to increase, because it changes the composition of how they pay, not what they actually pay. It changes the composition of how they pay, not what they actually pay. So instead of paying with cash, they're paying with a combination of cash and valuable time, and importantly, in that valuable time, they're not actually producing anything. In that valuable time, they're not actually producing anything. So they're sacrificing time, they're gaining the gas ultimately, but they're giving up all of the road clearance, all of the tree clearance, all the work they could have done had it not been for the price control. Oregon has recently done something kind of interesting. Oregon's recently done something kind of interesting. They passed a statewide rent control. A statewide rent control because housing in Oregon is really expensive. Housing in Portland specifically is really, really, really expensive. And so the state of Oregon has become the first state to pass a statewide rent control law. A statewide rent control capping at 7% plus the rate of inflation the increases in rent that landlords can ask for from one year to the next. And there's much rejoicing, again, among tenants who now have controlled rent and now don't have to pay as much. Big win for them, right? Wrong. Wrong. For exactly the same set of reasons. For exactly the same set of reasons. Now, then the Oregon rent control is a little bit more complicated than the price ceilings that you learn about when you take principles of micro, principles of macro, but the logic is basically the same. The logic is basically the same. If you hold the price by law below that which will clear the market, quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied. Quantity demanded exceeds quantity supplied, and there's a housing shortage. So you take a problem, which is there's not a whole lot of housing, and specifically not a lot of affordable housing, and this is important, okay? And you make that problem worse. Okay? You take that and you make that problem worse. Now then, how do we, bless you, okay? There are a lot of different ways that people have come up with to deal with or get around things like rent control. Well, first we got the shortage, but we have to be careful now about how exactly it is that we define the good in question. Maybe we say, well, the rent control only applies to unfurnished apartments. Okay. Well, in that case, then imagine that this is my apartment here. Put some furniture in there. And say, oh, no. No, the rent control only applies to unfurnished apartments. This is a furnished apartment. And I can now charge the market rent for it. Or I can say, well, yeah, you can rent the apartment for $500 a month, and then you can rent the furniture for an additional $1,000 a month. Okay, so maybe we bundle the two things together. Well, then the regulators maybe have to come up with something else. The regulators have to come up with something else to say, well, this is another way that we're going to try to keep rent low. And then landlords and customers might find other ways to get around it. So there's this cat and mouse game that goes on that is completely superfluous relative to what would maximize value, because people are investing not in providing new housing or better housing or whatever, but they're investing in trying to find ways around the rules. Okay? And when they're investing in trying to find ways around the rules, then they're either wasting resources directly, or they're wasting resources relative to what might have been. As Dr. Harpedal mentioned, I went to graduate school in St. Louis. And St. Louis has a baseball team that you might have heard of, the Cardinals. And when I was in graduate school in the early 2000s, wow, it's like it's 15 years ago now. Pardon me while I weep. Anyway, the Cardinals were really good when I was in graduate school. It was the Cardinals of Albert Pujols and Jim Edmonds and Scott Rowland, and they were in the playoffs pretty regularly, and they went to the World Series in 2004, and they won it in 2006 right after I finished. And one year I got to thinking, maybe we should go to the Cardinals, go see the Cardinals in the playoffs. They had first round playoff games against the Dodgers. And I thought, okay, this might be fun. Let's look on eBay. Let's look on eBay and see what Cardinals tickets are going for this game against the Dodgers. So I looked on eBay, and I noticed something really, really weird. Really weird. All of these people were auctioning off like those little fold-up pocket schedules that you can get and put in your wallet. It'd be something like, get this fold-up pocket schedule for $500. Or authentic St. Louis Cardinals baseball cap, $500. Or St. Louis Cardinals refrigerator magnet, $500. Well, that's weird. Then you look at the fine print, so to speak, or it's not even fine print, it just says, if you win the auction, we'll throw in 4 tickets to the Cardinals-Dodgers game. This is an example of what the economist Israel Kirzner might have called superfluous discovery. In this case, Missouri had, and probably still has, a fairly stringent set of regulations on ticket scalping. The market price, the price that would have cleared the market for the Cardinals-Dodgers tickets, was well above the face value of the tickets. And so what a lot of people did, and I thought this was very, very clever, is they auctioned off stuff on eBay like pocket schedules and hats and refrigerator magnets and said, oh, okay, if you win, then we'll throw in 4 tickets to the Cardinals-Dodgers playoff game. Which on one hand, like the part of me that loves human ingenuity, just found this beautiful. The part of me that understands the economic way of thinking, on the other hand, found this tragic. Because here's all of this creative energy that was expended not to create new value on net, but to get around rules and to get around laws that have been aimed unintentionally at preventing value-creating exchanges and at preventing people from finding mutually agreeable terms that make them both better off. So we have price gouging laws in Alabama and pretty much everywhere that prevent prices from rising after natural disasters and that hurt, again, exactly the people that we think we're helping. We have rent control, now again, in places like Oregon that will, wait for it, hurt the people that we think we're helping, in part by encouraging what's called superfluous discovery, in part two, by encouraging people to compete inefficiently, by doing things like accepting lower quality housing and stuff like that. And we also have, as I understand it, now in Arkansas, a higher minimum wage, a price floor, okay, a price floor in the market for labor, okay, a price floor that keeps, well, I think it's what, $9.25 an hour now, and then on January 1st, 2021, I believe it goes up to 11, if I'm not mistaken. And there's much rejoicing, again, because we've struck a blow for the working class and struck a blow for the poor by requiring that they be paid now $11 an hour. Well, is this, in fact, actually going to be good for Arkansas workers? Again, the question here is not, is this good for Arkansas businesses or is this good for employers? The question is this good for exactly the people that we think we're trying to help? And I think in the case of something like a minimum wage, which again is a price floor in the market for labor, the answer is once again no. Because what happens if we push the price up with a price floor? Well, by the law of supply, the quantity supplied increases, so more people want to work. Well, that's a good thing, probably. But fewer people are going to be hired. Firms wish to hire fewer people because the law of demand says that as you increase the price, quantity demanded goes down. And this is broadly consistent with the empirical literature. Economists who have studied this have found that there are, at the very least, modest reductions in employment from minimum wage laws and minimum wage increases. And modest reductions in employment when we artificially increase the price of labor legislatively. But it goes farther than this. Okay? It goes farther than this. There are other ways, I think, in which something like a minimum wage makes, again, the people that we think we're helping worse off. One could argue, and this is a respectable argument that could very well be true, that, okay, fine, we're going to get some reductions in employment as a result of this higher minimum wage. With some reductions in employment as a result of this higher minimum wage, but we're willing to accept that. We're willing to accept that because it means that low-wage workers are going to earn more money on net. The benefit that they get from higher wages will exceed the cost to them from fewer hours available. And again, like I said, that's a good argument. Okay? That's a good argument. It's one that you can make. But it's one that doesn't convince me. It's one that doesn't convince me largely because there are a lot of things, a lot of attributes of employment, and a lot of attributes of an employment contract, and a lot of attributes of a job that aren't just wages. People work for a lot of different reasons. They work for wages, but they also work for job satisfaction. They work for benefits. They work for flexibility. Okay, and this is a really, 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 really important one, flexibility, especially once you start having children. Okay, flexibility really, really, really matters a lot. Okay, they work for, fill in the blank here, all sorts of different reasons why people get jobs, why people work, and what people are compensated with. What we do when we pass the minimum wage is we effectively pass a rule requiring that people take a larger chunk of their compensation in the form of wages. Larger chunk of their compensation in the form of wages. So we reduce the quantity of labor demanded, and of those who are still able to work, who are still able to supply hours of labor, they are required to take a bigger chunk of their income in the form of wages, which doesn't sound like a bad thing necessarily. But if you were otherwise willing to trade off wages for more flexibility, more fun, more job satisfaction, better benefits, etc., then this is something that might make you worse off. And again, there's evidence to suggest that a lot of these effects are present in places where we have higher minimum wages. Benefits are not as generous as they once were. Schedules aren't as flexible as they once were. Jobs are harder and more intense than they once were. Okay. And further, people might end up spending more time searching for work. Okay, people might spend more time searching for work, consuming, again, a very valuable resource, their time, not producing anything, but merely looking for now an opportunity to exchange. So when we have a price ceiling, we get a shortage. When we have a price floor, like a minimum wage, we get a surplus. In response to price floors, we change the margins on which people compete, and once again, leave exactly the people that we think we're helping worse off. Last thing I want to talk about for just a couple of minutes is international trade. Thinking about when the scenarios in which we might look and say, well, the prices are wrong. The prices are wrong in the international economy. We need to make America great again by imposing special taxes on steel, special taxes on aluminum, special taxes on all sorts of goods produced in foreign countries, special taxes on, for example, sugar. Okay. So we import a lot of sugar, and a lot of sugar is produced in countries like Brazil. Now then, I do get to travel a good bit, and I really, really enjoy it. When I travel, sometimes I actually get to leave the country. And hadn't been for a while, but in October, I got to take a trip to Canada. And actually got to go back to Canada in January. And when I leave the US, I always drink a Coke that's sweetened the way God intended it, with actual sugar, as opposed to corn syrup, which is what we sweeten with in the United States. And one might ask, why is it that we sweeten Coke in an obviously heretical and ungodly fashion with corn syrup rather than actual sugar? And the reason for it is because of tariffs, these special taxes on goods produced in foreign countries, specifically in this case, sugar. The world price of sugar, as a result of tariffs and quotas, the world price is much lower than the domestic price of sugar in the United States. Therefore, people turn to a cheaper substitute. And that cheaper substitute is corn syrup. Are Americans better off, or are Americans worse off as a result of the sugar program or as a result of the sugar tariff? There's a consensus among professional economists, and we don't agree on everything. In fact, there's probably a lot we don't agree on much. But this is one thing that we do agree on. And in fact, there's recent research showing this appears to be the case with respect to the recent steel tariffs. We agree that reductions in international trade due to tariffs and quotas leave Americans worse off, or leave the people in the country that are imposing the tariffs worse off. How can this be? One might argue. Again, I live in Birmingham, Alabama, former steel town, and the steel mills are some of the steel mills are firing back up. And steel companies are earning record profits now as a result of the steel tariff. How could I possibly say that this isn't true? Well, again, we have to look not just at what we intend to see happen, but we're going to have to look a little bit beyond this and ask, okay, what are the perhaps more difficult to see effects, or some of the more difficult to see costs of this tariff, or the more difficult to see cost of this policy? And in the case, again, in the case of something like a tariff, what we see is more steel workers. What we see is more people working in sugar fields in Florida and places like that. What we don't see, however, is the alternative uses of those resources that we have to forego, okay, in order to produce stuff domestically, in order to produce steel domestically, in order to produce sugar domestically, in order to produce whatever domestically. Now, rather than go into the details, I'll just close with a story. Again, like I said, I get to travel occasionally, and it's a lot of fun. And about 6 years ago, 6 years ago or so, I got to speak at a conference in Brazil, which was really, really neat. And a congressman from Florida has described Brazil as the OPEC of sugar and argued that we need to have big tariffs on sugar so that we're not dependent on the OPEC of sugar for American sugar. Okay? Well, anyway, I'm invited to speak at this thing in Brazil, and I asked my Facebook network if I should pay the extra $100 to sit in a comfort seat on an overnight flight from Atlanta to Rio de Janeiro. And there was some going back and forth, and then my sister, so I had two sisters. One of my sisters was a missionary in Brazil for a few years, and she said, yeah, you should totally do it for a bunch of different reasons. One, obviously you'll actually get some sleep probably because you'll be more comfortable. But two, given the time of year that you're going, it's February or so, if you're farther back in the plane, you're going to be surrounded by Brazilian teenagers who are on their way back from their summer trip to Disney World. And then it hits me about the beauty and the greatness and the grandeur and the awesomeness of free trade. One of the reasons why tariffs are a bad idea, because Brazilian teenagers go to Disney World. Let's imagine that we were to completely eliminate the American sugar program and begin massively increasing imports from Brazil. Well, a lot of American sugar producers would probably go out of business. In particular, a lot of Floridian sugar producers might go out of business. Would those producers therefore starve to death? The answer, I think, is no. Because why in the world do all of these Brazilian sugar barons wish to sell us sugar? Well, they want dollars. What do they want dollars for? Well, they want dollars because they want to buy stuff, and specifically they want to buy American stuff, like, for example, trips to Disney World. So, you've heard it said God doesn't close a door without opening a window. Well, this is a classic example. This would be a perfect example of that. We might close one set of doors, which would be reducing employment opportunities in the Florida sugar industry, but we'd be opening a lot of other doors, which would be increasing opportunities in Florida tourism. Okay? Because a lot more Brazilian teenagers perhaps use these earnings to go to Disney World. Well, that's then going to create demand for people to dance around in Mickey Mouse costumes. It's going to create opportunities for people to work in hotels, to work in hospitality, to work at Disney World, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We would save resources, we would get more sugar, we would have more opportunities, and America would be greater than it otherwise would be. So there are a lot of different reasons to think about prices and why prices matter, why prices are important. I've discussed three of them: price ceilings, price floors, and specifically interference with international trade. I'm happy to answer any questions that y'all might have. Economic education is one of my passions. I too am like Acre on Twitter. You can find me at @Carden, or look for the hashtag FreeBookFriday, where you'll be able to get or you'll be able to find a lot of books underlying a lot of the points that I've made today. Thanks again for joining us. I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Horpedal and answer any questions you guys have.